Um, yeah, thanks very much everyone for coming and to Freedom Film Network for organizing this really important conference. In fact, the Radar project in a previous iteration was launched actually at the first Freedom Film Network conference. I think about 4 years ago, almost now. Today, this session, what we are going to be doing is we are launching this report on self-censorship that we are doing. That we did last year, actually, and it's called Understanding the Impact of Self-Censorship Among Artists and Cultural Workers in Malaysia. And it's a joint collaborative project that we did with the Merdeka Center for Opinion Research, ArtsEquator, as well as Five Arts Center. So what we plan to do basically is to kind of walk you through some aspects of this report. I'll just briefly introduce the both of us. Yeah, my name is Mark Tay. I am a performance maker, curator, and researcher. I'm a member of Five Arts Center, this collective that's been around for way too long. And this, I have the great pleasure to do this session with Kathy Rowland. I think a lot of people here will know that Kathy is a bit of a legend in arts research, arts advocacy, and some of the older people in the room might remember her as one of the co-founders of the original Kaki Seni, that much missed arts website. But Kathy is in her role here today as the co-founder and head of research at ArtsEquator, which is the regional kind of platform, right? Kathy, it says here, has worked in the arts for over 30 years only, in the areas of critical writing and arts advocacy, and also with a special kind of interest in artistic freedom. Kathy, of course, initiated this Southeast Asian Artistic Freedom Radar project. It's a mouthful. The Radar stands for Research and Documentation Resource. Some of you attended the earlier morning session where our colleagues Lynn and Orr presented, some findings from Thailand and Vietnam, respectively. But I'll let Kathy introduce ArtsEquator, Radar more specifically.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. It's really, really good to be back. Thank you to Freedom Film Network for organizing this event and for also giving ArtsEquator a lot of space to share our findings. So the context for this pilot into self-censorship in Malaysia actually is the wider project that we run, which is actually a kind of research and documentation project that has been going on since 2022. And what we do is we document cases of artistic censorship, challenges, controversy, anything that stands in the way of artistic freedom at the moment in 7 countries in Southeast Asia. And the reason that we do it, I think, is quite, maybe if I can just take you very quickly, this is kind of our thought process when we kind of were thinking about what's the theory of change and what we do. It really is about the challenges that artistic freedom in Southeast Asia faces, and I should say this is not unique to Southeast Asia. When if you in the Middle East, in Europe at the moment, in North America and South America and Africa, the conditions are very similar, right? This is not unique to us at all. The multi-pronged kind of threats that it's coming from everywhere, and our colleague Orr from Thailand kind of took us through very carefully through that. But also the lack of data, the lack of awareness about our rights and our rights as citizens, our rights as artists, and as our rights as producers of creative work is one of the factors that I think leads to, so there are threats, but it's also external threats, but also a lack of understanding about what our rights are. The other thing is there's a lot of talk. Artists will tell you a lot about the fact that they face censorship, but when it comes to lobbying, when it comes to the activists, and the people who can actually make policy changes, there's often a lack of concrete data. So that's one of the reasons why we actually started our project. But basically, what we're well known for is the mapping of threats, which is the documentation of cases. But we are also very quickly, if I can just say that we're about to start on a project that looks at mapping the resources, because what we realize is that when artists are attacked, there are some places, Malaysia being one of them, and the Philippines being another, Thailand as well, where there is an ecosystem of support, whether it's legal, emotional, kind of rights-based support that actually is there for the artists. But in other places, Singapore being one example, there is actually very little support. There's support from peers, from community members, but they may not have the skills that a lawyer might have. They won't have the kind of the communication skills to deal with this onslaught of thousands of posts attacking an artist, for example. So our next step really is to look at what the artist's needs are and what are the available support systems in each national level, regional level, and try and kind of identify where the differences are. So the censorship, the self-censorship project kind of sits in between these two, mapping of threats and mapping of resilience, because we're trying to understand what the artists experience and what their needs are. This is a pilot, so, you know, lots of mea culpas, which I will then hand over to Mark to talk about.
I'll do the heavy lifting with the mea culpas. Yep. Yep. So, guys, why try to organize and study self-censorship, right? Why do that? Why do a pilot project on that? Actually, this, I guess, direction for the Radar project was really informed by the conversations that we were having with artists and cultural workers, some of whom their projects, their works were censored or faced like threats, essentially. If you visited the Radar website and database, you will know that basically we're documenting publicly available known cases that are out there in the media, or artists have come forward, producers have come forward to say that we've been censored, and then we can document it in that way. Some of the artists that we spoke to across the region, they raised questions about how do we document and study self-censorship, given that it's hidden. You know, like, okay, the data that you have about what art forms get censored, what topics get censored, who's doing the censoring, who's abetting them and supporting them. I mean, that's all great, but like, what about this kind of hidden aspect, you know, like the cop in our head, so to speak? How do we talk about that? How do we find language to talk about that? What is the data if such thing can be made possible? We want to look at this, how to document and study self-censorship, its impact on mental health and well-being of artists, producers, stakeholders who are affected, the kind of more emotional and affective parts as well. You know, because once work is censored, people always just like let the controversy rise and then kind of forget about the case, right? So this pilot project in Malaysia is to understand how self-censorship may be perceived and practiced amongst artists. Also want to explore like the direct or indirect experiences of maybe the increase of self-censorship amongst artists, right? And given what I said just now, that, you know, a lot of self-censorship, if not all, is kind of hidden, right? Or internalized or outsourced from the state, internalized by artists, outsourced from the state, outsourced from authorities, right? It becomes more difficult to hold the agents accountable. Right? So this is not easy data to get. And for that reason, we were very kind of happy to partner with the Merdeka Center for Opinion Research. I think many people know them, who conduct social analysis and research with a particular emphasis on basically developing social indicators and data, so that we can have a bit more evidence when we talk about, you know, things as hidden as self-censorship. Yeah, so we approached Merdeka Center to kind of lean on their expertise and to learn from their methodology of conducting focus group discussions and in-depth interviews, which is things that we are still learning under the Radar project. We have a different way of research, yeah, which we won't go into here. Interestingly, of course, Merdeka Center was very interested to collaborate actually with ArtsEquator and Five Arts Center, because they don't usually have artists coming to them, or you know, art stakeholders coming to them. So they were interested also, like, well, how do artists look at self-censorship, but maybe some other kind of issues related to the national narrative. So they had their own, you know, 3 or 4 sets of questions that they wanted to ask as well. So this is kind of the motivations behind the project and kind of why we went into it. But maybe some working definitions might be useful, Kathy, and to kind of unpack a little bit more how self-censorship is like censorship, but also a bit different.
So in fact, there's actually been theoretically, just in terms of there are some, you know, kind of contestations about really is self-censorship, is it just a different form of censorship, or is it something that's quite distinct? Interestingly, a lot of the research has actually been done by sociologists, for example, looking at how self-censorship operates in the family unit. So where, for example, if there's sexual abuse or incest, and how the victims themselves will actually be quiet about it and hold that information silent, or else within the corporate sector, right? What compels some people to kind of hide corporate irregularities versus the whistleblowers, or in military situations where there are soldiers that will not report war crimes, but then some does. So those are some of the contexts where there's been more kind of theoretical studies about it. In general, though, most of the studies that we looked at was really in media, in academia, so self-censorship within media sectors, within academia, and very, very little. I mean, we couldn't really find much about self-censorship in the arts. There are articles written about it, or experiences or case studies, but not really the kind of research that we were trying to do. There is quite a well-known study on kind of self-censorship within campuses done by FIRE in the US, by an organization called FIRE, which is also kind of quite important. So one of the challenges, I think, is trying to, in a way, find a kind of definition that really worked, because in some cases there's a slippage between, this fine line between censoring yourself, self-restraint, editorial choice, strategy, right? Is delaying or doing something in a different way an act of self-censorship, or is it strategic, right? And these are artistic questions that I think even as practitioners we have difficulty understanding. So for us it was important to kind of maybe look for some definitions, but in the questioning it was really to hear what the artist had to say. And there were different, big surprise, there was, different versions and different kind of conceptions of it. But I find that these are two kind of quotes and kind of explanations of it that are quite useful. But I think what's important to say is that there has to be some kind of sense of desire to say, to be, to do, or to make something. There's a desire, but then also something within yourself that's preventing you from actually acting on that desire. And so the self is both the creator of the work, but also the instrument. But then the question to ask ourselves is the instrument, are we the instrument, and are we responding to something that's external? And the research does show that artists are motivated by a lot of these external factors that impose itself onto themselves. But I think that the Brutane and, okay, I can't pronounce his name, sorry, the idea of structural censorship, and that it's both, it's socialized, right? That we're socialized into a particular form of behavior, and that it is both the fear of repercussions, but also the loss of rewards that impacts some of our behavior to self-censor.
Let's get into how we kind of organized it a little bit, and I will share some key findings from the research. Yeah. So how, basically, I think it's like what Anna said, I think, at the earlier section, where she said, like, be in the same room and share lah. that was the basic kind of like framework for organizing these focus group discussions, right? So, between Merdeka Center, ArtsEquator, and Five Arts Center, we collaborated on framing topics and the questions related to self-censorship and its impact. We had a few kind of areas that we wanted to look into. How do artists define self-censorship? What are their experiences of it? What is the connection between outright censorship and self-censorship? In their respective fields, film and broadcasting, publication, performing arts, so on and so forth, what are the perceived taboo topics when creating? What do they feel are risks and consequences that they anticipate for, or they try and avoid, or they don't want to deal with? And of course, the impact on mental health, emotional well-being, their perception of their work that has gone through all these strategic or, yeah, kind of changes. So yeah, a lot of like thinking about what it means for the person. Yeah. So basically, there were 4 cluster groups that we organized, and we basically had about 37 participants. Yeah. Because it's a pilot project, we tried to be as inclusive as possible. But of course, it does prioritize a primarily kind of Klang Valley perspective because people had to come physically. There were a few sessions on Zoom, but more or less, this is the breakdown of the 37 people who kind of participated. At the same time, Merdeka Center also conducted 4 in-depth interviews. So these are case vignettes that you can read in the publication. I won't go into, but they basically give their direct interviews with 4 of the participants, and they give a kind of ground level experience of how artists negotiate this in quite a lot of detail, keeping in mind that artists always wear multiple overlapping hats. They are educators, they are sometimes activists, they are sometimes organizers, curators, producers of other people's works. So, when when dealing with censorship and self-censorship, they're actually negotiating multiple hats at the same time. And this is very, very important. It's never just me and my work. That's actually quite a rare instance that we find. Yeah. So let's go to some of the findings. So these artists from our FGDs, 37 people, their kind of understanding of self-censorship, right? For many, self-censorship is seen as kind of inevitable, right? It's internalized as a kind of professional reality. Artists often calculate risks before expressing ideas that might express authorities or funders or audiences. As Kathy mentioned, it's often understood or rationalized as restraint or adjustment rather than like outright self-censorship. Until that's raised, maybe artists are not so much thinking about it in those terms. Yeah. Of course, the practice is learned and reinforced by past experiences to themselves and to peers that they can see, or to younger or older generation artists. Yeah. And we found that artists hold quite mixed views. Some see it as negotiating self-censorship is just necessary, just a practical necessity. Others see it very strongly as a compromise of their integrity, their self-worth, their authenticity as artists, as human beings. Yeah. I won't go into generational difference because that comes up quite a bit. And we can go into it later. Drivers of self-censorship, is shaped by external regulations and institutional protocols. Of course, in Malaysia, we know that film publishing, theater, music, all subject to licensing, content reviews, potential bans, and so on and so forth, right? This second point, I think, is important to re-emphasize again, that public commentators and societal expectations play a major, major role. These are the non-state actors, which has been referenced many times already today. Yeah. We're talking about the public. We're talking about online. Your work, clips of your film, something that you say gets taken out of context. I think Firdaus this morning talked about the depth of context, right? And gets like viral, and this creates all kinds of things. And of course, one particular artist said something really remarkable in one of the FGDs, which I remember. They said that they try really hard not to censor when they're creating, but they self-censor when it comes to what they post online and when they're talking to the media. So this is a very important kind of like reflection actually that we found that was articulated. I think I'll just move us on. I'm just conscious of time. Impact on mental health and well-being, bad lah. Yeah. I won't go into it, but yeah, horrible, bad, difficult, tragic. Yeah. Maybe a bit related to that is perceptions, the artist's perceptions of their censored versus uncensored work, right? We heard a lot of things about having to produce safer work that made artists feel incomplete, like the work wasn't complete. It doesn't feel like my real voice, versus creating more genuine or personally meaningful work when they feel that they are not self-censoring. Yeah. Many mentioned that they feel if they've self-censored or they've been censored, they feel very disconnected from the censored product, basically from the products of their labor. So they feel alienated, right? From the work that they've done. It carries their name, it carries their reputation, it carries their brand, if we want to use that term. But they feel like very alienated from this. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Fear and consequences are something that we are all very familiar with in terms of the work that we do, and just even the situation, I think, has been such that within the society now. I was thinking about what Putra said earlier about the panopticon, right? Foucault's kind of that kind of 360-degree kind of view, and that's what social media has done to us. So so aside from the obvious, right, the laws and the censorship and the bans and prosecution, the power of the community to police behavior has just grown exponentially, and that is something that came up again and again and again, aside from kind of the financial loss and so on. And what we're also seeing is that after, so there's fear before, but also there's this kind of fear after. When you do it, the desire to conceal what you've done is very strong, because there's a lot of shame and judgment attached to it from your peers, right? There can be, it's almost in some cases, if you are attacked by the religious authorities for a play that you do, although there is enormous pressure, but there is also a kind of sense that you have fought the good fight. So, and that you have earned some sort of respect, let's say, from certain sectors of your peers. With self-censorship, however, there is a sense of deeper shame that is really important to note, because we believe it's a displacement of blame, right? The blame really, in fact, shouldn't be on the artist that makes this choice, because it is the wider kind of community, the legal context that then, turns the artist into an instrument against themselves. So that was one of the kind of things that I think came up. I think I also want to maybe just pick up on this other point, which is about the financial loss. And I don't want to kind of belittle it, because there's sometimes within ourselves as well the sense that as artists, we should be doing it for the love of it, and we should not pursue financial gain. A really important thing is to look at the Malaysian context. And if you look at the profile of a lot of our pioneer artists, the 60s and the 70s and so on, I mean, there's no research on this, and someone should research project for someone to take up. But the profile would have actually been that, first of all, a lot of them would have been from middle class, upper middle class, one. So they would have come already from a certain kind of comfortable context. A lot of them would have had day jobs, and the arts was something they pursued on top of their careers as lawyers, as teachers, as art educators. We've seen that shift, ever since, which is good as the ecosystem has developed, as this kind of the discourse of the creative industries has grown, as there's been more kind of democratic access to arts education. The profile of artists and people working in the arts sector, I think, has also changed. One, the profile of, they might not come from independent family wealth. And two, the arts, there's just enough money for you to make a career. And so it means that if something happens to you, it's not like you have a day job to hold on to. This is your financial, space, right? And so that I think in some ways the development of the arts infrastructure becomes both a boon for us, but it also then becomes a controlling factor. And isn't that the case for everything in life, right? As long as you're plugged into the capitalist system, it breeds conformity, right? The report can be downloaded on our website, but I want to maybe just let me just quickly go to the comparative analysis. What we found was that when we spoke to the artists across the board, the things that we noticed that across the different clusters of, kind of really independent musicians versus, kind of influencers and content creators that had millions of viewers and so on, there was certain generational differences that were recurrent across that. And it actually makes for quite depressing reading, right? As you'll see, what the research shows was that within younger performers, those that are entering the system, and I'll quote, for them, self-censorship is not a reactive act, but a learned instinct, one reinforced by constant exposure to digital outrage. So both the practices and the examples that they see before them through the mid-career and elder artists, plus combined with the kind of changing landscape of media, of public kind of outrage, has socialized them into silence, essentially. Mid-career practitioners, in some ways, kind of take a much more pragmatic experience, because for them, I think the desire for career longevity is quite important. So for them, it's, to quote one of them, a system of quiet rebellion, right? And I'll quote a filmmaker who says, I still want to push, but I have to think of my family. If my work is banned, it's not just me who suffers. And then for the older practitioners, and this quote is actually from a senior, an older practitioner, right? Where really the resistance is almost seen as kind of almost futile, that, I will just do my work and I will find a way to get around it, if not, because it's just too exhausting. And so what we're seeing then is that for the impact for the Malaysian arts ecosystem and the arts kind of sector is that we're going to get work that is more similar, that is safer, and we're going to kind of breed a kind of generation upon generation of compliance. Yeah, the other thing that we saw was actually in terms of gender, and this is no surprise because we see in the online space just across the board, women are much more vulnerable. And I say women, I include, trans women as well. That if not more, I think, that they are much more attacked. But the women articulated that that there are so few spaces for women artists. Even when something happens, there is no one to report to. So it's not just that women are more targeted, they are more targeted using gendered language, the threat of sexual violence, for example, but also that the support systems for women, are much more fragile and underdeveloped. And so what this does is that it entrenches the kind of gender imbalance in the arts. I mean, the gender imbalance that we have in our society, but then also within the arts. It just means that we're going to have less women doing work that is exciting or that really talks about women's issues, and women's issues are society's issues. So it just impoverishes our kind of social space, not to say our cultural space as well. So what we'll maybe we'll run the slides because we looked at some of the implications of this and what this means for us, as a community in terms of the ecosystem as practitioners. We really did want to open it up, so we'd like to leave as much time for questions and answers as possible.
So, we looked at implications at various kind of levels for obviously artists and cultural workers, for cultural organizations, collectives, and institutions, venues, for policymakers and regulators, as well as for the larger arts ecosystem and actually society at large. This point that Kathy makes, the arts sector is very much part of society, so it's like a petri dish actually. The kind of effects that flow back and forth between society and the arts. I think we'll leave the space open because you can now download the report and you can read it directly. It's 55 pages, but we've kind of gone through the main points. And I should just mention that the report is written by Tasha Nantini at the Merdeka Center, and we're really, really grateful to them actually for working on this with us, and we learned a lot through this particular process. Shall we just open up to the floor? There are already questions.
Hi, my name is Goh Yu Ping, and about my English, lah.
Boleh.
So, is your research ada cari tak siapa yang mengancam, yang menyebabkan kita kena censorship? Adakah mereka orang-orang itu ada dari AI punya komputer, mereka yang buat AI question yang cakap buruk-buruk, ataupun agensi-agensi yang tertentu atau kumpulan-kumpulan yang tertentu yang sengaja nak attack penggiat-penggiat seni budaya, creative people? Adakah your research paper search for who is the one selalu buat kacau?
So I'll just rephrase really quickly for everyone. So Go's asking, like, do we look at who is behind the censorship, whether they're state actors or non-state actors? So directly to this particular report, we didn't go into that. Of course, it's covered in some of the anecdotes from the artists, but actually that is our usual research, which you can find on the Radar website. So Radar already produces this huge database of over 800 cases, and it publishes country reports. There's already 3 or 4 Malaysian country reports over the last few years that talks about exactly what you're asking, Go. Who is censoring, what institutions, who are the other kind of non-state actors, whether they might be religious influencers, they might be other parts of civil society, they might be netizens, which has been talked about a lot today. So that is the kind of zoom out work that Radar's always doing, constant monitoring. This one is to capture artist voices, artist experience in thinking about self-censorship. Yeah, so it's very specific and individual, and yeah, it's getting into a room and talking about this.
Hi, my name is Pradaus. I am a researcher. So the question I have is an approach that seems to be adopted by some filmmakers, where they say, all right, I'll do the movie that I want, the way that I want it, but I'll just forget about public screening and local audience. I'll just have it screened overseas at international film festivals, and that way I don't need to worry about censorship, self-censorship. So is that an out, and how feasible is that when looking at it from the Malaysian film industry perspective? Thank you.
So I think one, I want to really make clear that when we use terms like self-censorship or censorship, we're actually quite neutral, right? So we take a researcher kind of position that we're not saying that self-censorship is a negative point, right? It is, right? To quote Cherian George, who says censorship is, right? It just is. Yes, but I would say that it would qualify as self-censorship in a way, because although you're making the work as you want, you're actually already segmentizing the access and you're restricting the access. It's a strategy, and it can be a very successful strategy, but it is a form of self-censorship as well.
Sorry, I was just wondering if your report looks also from a timeline point of view, whether you see an evolution or a trend, and if so, what is that? And especially with regards to the use of social media and potentially also AI, which will also have an impact on freedom. So yeah, does your report look at trends? And if so, what are the trends? Is it getting better or worse?
For the self-censorship, at this point, we're not looking at, it's longitudinal at this point, because this is baseline, right? I mean, this in a way will be the first. And we don't know at this point whether we're going to do it as an annual or semi-annual kind of research, but we've started with Malaysia. We're going to expand it to the rest of Southeast Asia. Our mapping of threats, right? The mapping of actual cases does take a timeline and chronological approach. And now that we have 12 years of data and over 1,000 cases, we can already see the trends for where it's a third-party agent, what Go is talking about, where it's either religious authorities or the government or art stakeholders or corporate sector. We are able to see some trends already. But for the self-censorship, not yet. And I think it's quite hard to measure in some ways, because it's so subjective, right? You know, like I might say that the level of self-censorship I have is a 10, and someone else might say theirs is a 5. It's a little bit hard. I don't know about the methodology, but right now we're really at base. We're baseline. This is the first ever kind of research into self-censorship in Asia, as far as I know. I don't know. Sarah, I don't know if you, yeah, I don't think even in Europe there's any such report, yeah. But yes, we would love to do a comparison. Talk to me in 5 years' time.
Maybe I'll just also share a little bit, because next month we are publishing the country reports and the regional report about threats to artistic freedom and censorship. So that's the work that Radar does all the time. So this is the pilot project on self-censorship, right? In that particular project, I mean, they're interlinked, but I think one of the trends that has emerged that we have found, for example, is that Malaysia has a lot of multi-step threats, meaning in most of the rest of Southeast Asia that we're covering, you know, the police come in, or the Ministry of Culture comes in, or the exhibition space kind of comes in to make an intervention, right? But in Malaysia, we noticed that there's quite an increasing degree of cases where there are 4 steps to the process. So something happens online, you know, someone watches a taken out of context clip of a film, step 1. Step 2 is potentially a religious influencer, you know, kind of gets onto this. And then step 3 is a state authority kind of intervenes. Step 4, the police kind of comes. So we see this happening in Malaysia more than in other places. Yeah. So you can see the ecosystem of oppression, if we want to call it that, is something that you can look forward to in next month's report and in our life.
Hi, I'm Dime. I'm an artist and editor, so I use food to fly under the radar to talk about difficult or perhaps censored issues. My question, actually, I have to say that this is the turning panel that made me want to come to this event. So tying in with this morning's talk about geopolitical relations and censorship, and also the previous panel about money, I was wondering if in your research, did you come across any artists who were navigating self-censorship through the viewpoint of geopolitical relations? Because recently there was a PhD student, a Malaysian PhD student who was deported from Singapore. She's an NUS scholar, and she was deported for her political activism work. So there was another question saying how if it's banned in Malaysia, for example, maybe you can go outside, but what if you're banned outside as well? So did you come across that overlap in your research?
In general, yes, yes. But in this particular case, I don't think there were any cases where the artists that we spoke to talked about kind of geopolitical concerns. No, right? I don't remember. Within the kind of general documentation that we do, yes. So issues of, for example, Palestine and Gaza and the genocide has come up. Not so much, let's say, if you were doing the research, for example, in Europe, in Germany, or in America, I think the numbers are much, much higher, but I think it's underdocumented. Maybe because conceptually the idea that they're censoring the arts is still alien even to themselves. But I think here in Singapore, yeah, there've been, cases. I think there is a group that has just released a report about, in Singapore, it's a group that's released a report about how Gaza and the genocide is being suppressed or controlled, but not just in the arts, across the board, right? In Southeast Asia, we've had a couple of cases. There was one case in Indonesia, one case in the Philippines, and one case in Thailand that had something to do with the genocide, where there were controls or there were challenges to the work. But generally in Southeast Asia, most of the kind of state governments at the moment, the positioning is a little bit more supportive to. It's a little bit more permissible to talk about the genocide than in let's say, in the West.
In Singapore, I understand that the word decolonization is quite hot in a lot of, not hot as in like popular, so it's very trendy, like whether it's in like a book fair or whether they're talking about, they look at it from a far away, like with a 10-foot pole, but they still appreciate the value, the commercial value of the word decolonization, say if you're curating an art show. But I think this scholar who was deported from Singapore, her work also focuses on decolonization. So no, but they didn't give her. It was her activism, yeah. But I feel that it's very confusing for an artist, because then you don't know where to go. You can't do it at home. You can't do it next door where the dollar is higher.
So to clarify, there are two things, I think for that case, in that particular case, is that one, we don't actually document academic research, number one. So generally, even in Malay, unless it's a publication of a book or in a book talk, then there has to be some kind of almost like creative thing. Then we do, only because we don't document media and we don't do academic, because there are already other people documenting those things. So we fill the gap where there's an absence. But we also controversially, and I should say, we don't document cases in Singapore yet, nor in Brunei, only because the funding that we have, which is European funding, doesn't allow us to cover Singapore and Brunei, because they are developed countries versus non-developed countries.
Economically developed.
Economically, sorry, GDP.
I think there's time for maybe like one more question.
Anne
Sorry,
had a question.
two. Maybe we can take two.
Yeah.
There was another arm up behind. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anne from Persatuan Penulis Berbilang Bahasa, or PEN Malaysia, and I'm a playwright and researcher. I want to say this is a great start. It's very exciting to see that self-censorship, other than other forms of state censorship and so on, which for so long. I think 37 respondents is a good start, right? It would get to bigger numbers. And to have not found it before, how do you write a history of silence? It's tricky. You have to find, you're not going to necessarily find it in obvious places. I'm just thinking though a little around also, because a lot of this reminds me of how we have been documenting, or others have been documenting, the demonization of LGBTQ, and the impact of that on people like us. It makes me sick. There's a sort of pathologization of there's a very strong and convincing story about how the negative impact of self-censorship is. But I noticed that actually there wasn't that much around, it didn't seem to be anyway, that the artists themselves about what they define self-censorship as. And so the point is really the myth of self-censorship. It might be a bit like the myth of the reputation of satire. debates around satire as to whether or not satire has bite or not is less important than the idea that satire has bite. So the idea of self-censorship being only damaging is something that I think we need to question, because after all, the panopticon thing, Foucault also talks about how censorship generates resistance, right? So the idea that actually, if people are talking about what they see themselves as self-censorship, other than having been primed or taken down a route which is sort of more binary, say, so then self-censorship equals bad, that kind of idea. That how else is it? It might actually be, it's also a venue, as you said also, I think, kind of strategy, of play, of how we make things. That's also a part of what self-censorship would be, so really just kind of this idea of the myth of self-censorship, that it is entirely bad and damaging, I think is one to also play with, and not necessarily just go down the negative impact path, because then we're all sick, unless we are free, and that kind of binary I don't think exists.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, I think that's a really good point, that we asked the artists to talk about what artistic freedom meant for them. I don't think that we had a question for them to define what self-censorship. Did we? We did. Okay.
It's in the report.
Okay.
It's in the report.
Yeah. I mean, Foucault and the idea of what's called the new censorship, which is actually 25 years old, is another conversation, right? And about it being productive. In terms of the theory of censorship, there's a big question between when is it self-restraint and when is it self-censorship. So I think a little bit of what you're saying kind of sits there, right? In between that, right? Yeah, I think that's something maybe we need to look at when we roll out the full kind of research. Please download the report for self-censorship. Please share it. Contact Mark or I if you have any feedback. If you have questions that you feel have not been asked, please send it to us, because we really, we want to improve this thing. I want to also maybe just end on the fact that one of the quotes that we got was, when something happens, what we want is dialogue and not punishment. And this idea of like having the ability to actually answer our detractors rather than to be punished into silence is I think quite an important point. The point about peer support and coming together, which has been a recurrent thing throughout the sessions today, were also really important. To just say thank you to Tasha and Merdeka Center, Ben, Sufyan and Tasha, with their expertise. We wouldn't have been able to do this without them. I want to also thank the 37 artists and cultural workers, some of whom are in the room, but out of respect to them, we've kept their identities anonymous. Please, we just want to say thank you to those that were there and who are here now to hear me say that your frankness and your bravery and your kind of willingness to articulate what you've been through is really important for us. I want to also thank Freedom Film Network, to Anna and Alicia and Brenda and the entire team. Thank you very much for organizing this conference, but also for just all the work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.